Ireland is the place where whiskey found its name. The home of whiskey distilling, the country that has produced whiskey for longer than anywhere else. Irish whiskey is defined by its people and places, the craftsmanship of our distillers and blenders, our celebrated home on the island of Ireland, on the very edge of Europe, where the continent meets the roar of the Atlantic Ocean. Irish whiskey has a depth and diversity unrivaled among other whiskies, many unique characters, but one shared spirit. There's always a new Irish whiskey brand or expression to savour, on the shelves of your off-licence, liquor store and online. Discover the depth and diversity of Irish whiskey.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to episode 3 of our Discover Irish Whiskey series, brought to you in collaboration with the Irish Whiskey Association. And today we've a very interesting topic, and we've some fantastic guests lined up. And we're talking about Irish finishing being world class, so leaders in cask finishing. Of course, it's very hard now to pick up a whiskey that hasn't been finished or matured in an unusual manner. So for this episode, we're joined again by our co-host, John Cashman, who will introduce our guests. So, John.
There.
Hey, you are here. Good evening.
How are
Not
you?
too bad. Not too bad at all now. Looking forward to this.
Yeah. You know, it's I suppose it's one of the things that I think recently has really come to define Irish whiskey, and the way that a lot of brands are trying to differentiate themselves in a very vibrant marketplace, and that is, I suppose, using what we can do, and that is different woods and different finishes, which is great for our industry, you know. So yeah, this should be a belter. So we have 4 guests again this week, and our first guest that I'm introducing alphabetically is a good friend of mine, the big man of the Teeling Distillery, Mr. Alex Chasko. He's one of only a handful of people in the whiskey industry that can physically make me feel small. Alex began his career as a brewer in his native Portland, Oregon. And then, having worked in a number of breweries in the US and also in Asia, in Singapore, he sent me into one of them once to make sure they were still doing the stuff right after he'd left. He, like many, attended Heriot Watt and got his master's in brewing and distilling. I first met Alex around 2009, maybe 2010, when he joined Cooley Distillery as innovation manager. And Alex was instrumental in building the new boutique distillery in Kilbeggan. I think many sleepless nights trying to figure out how to put a modern distillery into 250-year-old buildings would test many a person. But once constructed, Alex was let loose in that distillery, and coming up with very innovative mash bills, innovative distillates, and also exploring his love for different finishing casks. Employee number 1 at Teeling Distillery, he continued in this vein, releasing many varied styles and casks of whiskey, experimenting with again with distillates and a varied wood policy. You're welcome, Alex.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
Yeah, our next guest is Paul Corbett, who is the head distiller at Clonakilty Distillery. Paul has a degree in microbiology from my old alma mater of University College Cork. But I think postgraduate, working in labs and wearing white coats, convinced Paul that that type of life wasn't for him. Like Alex, he then went to Heriot Watt for the distilling and brewing degree. And this allowed him to change his career path. Initially as a brewer with C&C, and then maybe, and we'll find out possibly throughout this conversation, under Alex's tutelage at Teeling Distillery. Paul was the lead distiller in the early days of Teeling. He returned to his home county of Cork in 2018 and took up his present position with Clonakilty Distillery. responsible for all the blending of some of the amazing liquids coming out of Clonakilty, and also some of the new whiskies that will, I'm sure, hit the market over the next few years. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing what this very innovative distillery bring to the market to differentiate themselves from a lot of the other players in today's world. Paul, welcome.
Hi, John. Thanks.
Our next guest then is someone who's nearly in the industry as long as I am, Mr. Seamus Lowry from Proximo Spirits. Seamus's day job officially is key account manager across the country for a range of different brands, Bushmills only being one of those, but also the tequila brands, Kraken Rum, amongst some of the other brands. However, probably best known for his whiskey education, bringing the Bushmills brands to life in this market and also around the world. Seamus began his whiskey career like I did with Irish Distillers, working initially as a merchandiser and then a sales rep, and then worked his way up to key account management. And people figured out he was well able to give a yarn, so brand ambassadorial came quite easily to Seamus. A proud Connemara native. When not hosting Bushmills Zoom whiskey tastings, Seamus can be found probably on a little boat on some loch somewhere in the west of Ireland, fishing for his supper, sipping some proper 12. And finally, we have Sabine Sheehan. Sabine is brand manager and global brand ambassador for Lambay whiskey. And if we're in no doubt, there it is right behind her. Lambay is a recent entrant into the Irish whiskey vista. And it came about through a relationship between the Barings family, of Lambay Island, and the Camus family from the famous House of Camus Cognac Company. Using these Camus contacts, Lambay have really made a name for themselves in finishing their whiskies, not only on the island of Lambay, but also using very specially and selectively chosen former cognac casks. With a passion for barrel aging and a focus on sustainability, the Lambay have a brand that really exudes a modern, fresh take on Irish whiskey. And they're a company with a very bright future. And again, another company I'm really looking forward to see how things progress into the future. So all four of you are all very welcome. I suppose, kicking off, if I go back to when I started in this industry in the late 90s, there were 3 distilleries making whiskey in Ireland, obviously Cooley, Bushmills and Middleton. And of those 3 at that stage, I have to say it was probably Bushmills that took my attention due to the innovative nature of what they were doing. It was a time when finishing was really just, I think, beginning in Scotland. The Glenmorangie were bringing out the different cask finishes. And I was fortunate enough to be working with Bushmills in around 98 over in Copenhagen and instantly falling in love with the Bushmills 16. Now, one of the questions I really have, and I suppose this one very specifically to Seamus before we go more general, that brand, is it technically a whiskey finish or was it a matured whiskey, like triple matured or quadruple matured or whatever?
Straight off the bat, good evening all. Thanks for that lovely introduction, John. Straight into it, yeah, it's both. To give a Irish answer to an Irish question, 16 is a combination of the American aged malt and sherry aged malt, and we've taken these two and married them into port, and this is where the finishing side of it comes into it. So this is why we refer to it as a 3-wood whiskey, because you have the influence of the American cask, you have the influence of the sherry cask, which is pretty much anyone that knows Bushmills is very much part and parcel of the DNA of any of the Bushmills brands, bar Red Bush, where sherry's not involved. But then we've taken it for a further 6 months into the port cask, and that's where the finishing side of it comes in. So yeah, and that's been the hallmark of 16 from the day it was released, and I think that's what's it's garnered a lot of the attention of some of the whiskey drinkers out there, both Irish and international. So yeah.
Yeah, because it was interesting, because I remember once speaking with a master distiller in Scotland, and I almost, having a bit of a good verbal battle with him, because he was describing his whiskey as what he would describe as double matured. Here in Ireland, we would describe as finished, because for them it was, well, as far as I was concerned, it was in a bourbon barrel for X amount of years, and then it was in another cask just for a shorter amount of time. So in my mind, that's a finishing. But over in Scotland, that's seen as double maturation. So can we effectively define a finish versus a double maturation? And I'll throw that open to anyone who wants to jump in straight away. Again, not an easy starter, but hey, let's start the way we mean to go on. Anyone? We're all friends here.
They're all polite. So
Really?
look, we'll kick it up with Alex then. Go on.
Okay, well, yeah, there's a lot of different terms out there. It's finishing and double maturation, and we throw in marrying, I guess, into the equation too with our rum casks. Is it confusing? Yeah, probably. Can you get into an argument in a pub over it? I guess if you really want to. Does it really matter? Probably not. I think it's an interesting idea. It's like, yeah, okay, if you had it in a barrel, let's say you had it in a bourbon cask for 16 years, does it have to be in a port cask for more than 16 years to be not finished, right? So is it, I don't know if there's any real...
There is no official...
Sorry about this.
Yeah.
There is no official definition then of finishing, is there? I mean, generally 1 or 2 years is the accepted, but is there a technical definition of what a finish is?
I don't think so.
I think when you refer to Wikipedia and you refer to your usual search engines for that kind of terminology, it's really where it's been first placed in usually a bourbon barrel or a first fill barrel, and then it's usually the second or the third stages is kind of all considered part of the finishing of that liquid that adds its esters, its taste portfolio, etc., etc. So I think it's broad, Serghios, to be honest, but for us, cask finishing is ultimately what we're placing the first barrel matured liquid into in order to define the taste profile.
Paul, you were trying to get
Would I
in?
be wrong?
Slightly like the laws of rugby, it's down to interpretation. It's how you interpret it at times. So, I mean, sometimes it can be viewed finishing as in a series when you can count it in months. So you're looking for an influence. When you're in the plus 12 months onwards, it's my view, and it would be, is almost like the continuation of the maturation process, where you're looking for a more in-depth, ingrained, more DNA influencing type characteristic. So yeah, it's quite a subjective and divisive. I think, Serghios, you're right. There's nothing, I don't think, in the Act that clearly defines the definition of finishing versus double maturation or whatever it may be.
Paul, were you trying to get in there?
Yeah, I guess in my experience, say if I have a whiskey that's been matured in bourbon barrels and I want to do a port finish, say you put it into a first fill port cask, you can get like a lot of port influence in say the first 3 months, but you won't get any of that, say, that European oak influence in that first 3 months. So I'd say if for finishing, it would be just to get that influence from the liquid that's previously in the cask. But if you want to get a real more complex whiskey, including the influence from the new wood you put the cask into, that's when I'd say it's double matured. But again, there's no real time frame in mind for that. It's just whatever the distiller tastes the whiskey and thinks it's getting that more complex flavors into it.
Yeah. Is the fact that we have a certain amount of confusion over this straight away, is that a positive or a negative? Would you prefer if there was more restrictive, or is this what's great about it, the fact that we can't define it?
Well, I think, the more kind of rules and restrictions we put in place, like the less room for innovation is what we're going to have, and everyone's going to have to stick to these rules, and then invariable in time when more people come into the market, they're going to want to change these again. So I definitely try and keep things, as easy to follow as possible with as little complications.
I mean, if we can take it back a step, and I suppose look at what we're trying to achieve, either with maturation and with finishing. I mean, when we come to finishing, it's generally taking whiskey from a bourbon cask and putting it in some other form. I know there's a few, not many, second finishes, if you like, with bourbon again. So, but in general, we're talking about other woods. What is it we're trying to achieve? I mean, and, you know, what decisions have to be made in that process?
Can I take a crack at that one?
Go for it.
I think what I'm trying to achieve is that Irish whiskey has over 3,000 different flavor components that are already in it. And so for me, finishing is trying to highlight one or two or three of those over the rest that are all there. They're present, right? The fruits or the spice or the wood influence, right? But by putting it into a port or a sherry or some other wine cask or some other wood type even, you're trying to take a flavor that's already there and bring it up a notch. So like when we go into our Calvados casks, for example, right? We're taking those pears and those apple flavors that are already present and might already be called orchard fruits, but you're suddenly elevating it. And you're also, I think, bringing it to the forefront for the consumer of, I should be expecting apples and pears and pastry and sweetness coming from this, you know, with this whiskey. That's what I think we're trying to do with it, at least.
Yeah. I mean, is there... Go ahead, Seamus.
Go ahead, Seamus.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I mean, we, like, in the case of Bushmills, I mean, like, we've had really, I mean, I suppose in the last year, we've seen a great experience in working with them. I mean, with the Causeway collection, we've had a 10 different type of cask example launched in the last year alone. And like, you know, we took something like the new American Oak, which was a travel retail one, which I think it spent 14 years initially in American and sherry, and then it went into a virgin oak for 16 years. And really what it did was, it intensified the vanilla to almost a real soft, creamy kind of character, chocolatey, dairy notes. Those wood notes were coming out really, really strongly. And I mean, you know, virgin oak is used generally as a high influencer at the very start. If you see where virgin oak is used, you know, you get that big wood hit, and you know, and they don't tend to be used for too much longer. But, you know, I suppose it shows the experimental side of it. And a bit to Paul's point as well, you know, earlier on, that if we were honed in by too many regulations and rules, there'd be no room for adventure or experiment or even having a bit of fun with it to see what it does. And to Alex's point, it brings out those nuances, and, you know, you can test the boundary of what a cask can do for you, you know. So yeah, it does it, and you know, we've seen in certain cases where we've had wine into wine casks, so it doesn't necessarily always have to go the bourbon route as a marker. We've seen that with some of our stuff that we brought out lately.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you take it further back, I mean, it's only in the 60s really that we started using bourbon as the main maturation cask. So before that, I presume we were mainly sherry and sherry derivatives and fortified wines. So it's a relatively new thing. And of course, you know, the law in the States that says virgin casks must be used there for bourbons is a blessing for us, in the sense that we have a mind full of American oak casks, basically.
Plentiful supply, yeah.
Yeah, so supply isn't an issue. And I imagine price is very attractive in getting bourbon casks. So is that one of the reasons mainly why we use bourbon as the base for maturation? Is it cost, convenience?
I definitely think the price is a big factor at the moment, because at the moment you can buy a bourbon barrel for $70 per barrel if you're buying a container. And for a new distillery, say like ourselves, if you want to buy a new sherry cask, per sherry cask, you could be paying €600-800 per cask.
Yeah.
And that's if you can actually get them. Because a lot of what I've been finding at the moment, like recently, I got a consignment of sherry casks, and after nosing them when they came in, I immediately discarded them, saying, not going to fill them. I don't think they're actually bona-fide sherry casks.
Right.
So, so you can get a good supply of them. They're quite cheap. I think it's a no-brainer, really.
Yeah. What about the argument then that perhaps these cask finishes have been used, if you like, to enhance or mask whiskey that may be not as mature, or maybe, you know, just a base liquid? So I'm putting it politely.
They're covering the sins of the father with the finishing cask.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
can you
there's a few
mask
things there.
mistakes?
No, I don't think you can. I think if it's a crap spirit and crap cask, it's going to be a crap whiskey. There's really there's no way you can fudge the mistakes there. At best, you can try to hope that you can turn a negative into a positive with some strange, marketing spin or something like that on it. I think also, though, going back to why bourbon casks are used is, I think that consolidation, right, where it went from hundreds of different distilleries down to 3, meant that decisions were made by a very few number of people. And so if you had a ready, steady supply of high quality bourbon casks coming in from Kentucky, that was an easy thing. If we need to buy 5,000 casks this year, what are we going to do? We're going to go searching high and low around the continent for different casks, or are we just going to sign a contract with a guy in Louisville and move on?
Well, I suppose that opens up another question. And Alex, I mean, your approach in Teeling in terms of cask, I mean, your brand is synonymous with many different types of finishes and many different types of wood and different fortified wine. And Bushmills came out recently with quite a few. And I suppose, Paul, you've done a lot of experimentation there with the American breweries. Whereas, Sabine, you've taken the other, I mean, you've very much tied your brand to cognac and very much become the cognac finish specialists out there, if you like. What was the decision behind that? And is that restrictive, or is that easier to build a strong brand when you just specialize on one?
That's a good question, Serghios. I think to break that down a little bit, the company, the brand was created through the partnership between, the Camus Cognac House and Airings, and this is what was the inspiration for the story. But Camus in itself, when we talk about cognac, is, it's known for its absolutely fantastic, intense cognacs. And the French oak casks that they have and that we fortunately have direct access to are anything from 5 up to 50 years old. So, and they're already arriving to Ireland with that element of rancio, that lovely French phenomenon, where you have these beautiful, fruity kind of notes already in the wood. It's kind of a funky taste in the wood already because of the warehouses they're in. And then we're bringing it to the island. And we're playing around with not just the cognac cask aspect of our finishing, but also the maritime influence on those casks, because the casks are maturing right by the sea. So yeah, we're pinning our shirt to that particular finish right now, and most likely for the future, because we want to kind of really become the specialist in that area of cognac cask finishing. And even the art and style we do mature in is pretty much inspired by the French methodology rather than the Irish methodology. So it's kind of being influenced not just by the cask, but also our approach to blending and our approach then to the final finish. So we might use second, third fill cognac casks of varying ages with varying aromatic kind of compounds and intensity in the flavor. So yeah, that's something that we're really only discovering because we're only 4 years old. So we're only really discovering that now with our cask strengths and really identifying what is the intensity and flavor compared to, for example, the blends and the malts.
Excellent. And then what about the rest of you? I suppose you all offering a wide variety of cask finishes. Maybe the one that produces the most variety, Alex, obviously Teeling are synonymous with the huge variety that you do in terms of cask finishing. What was the reasoning? I mean, despite all the different finishes that you have, are you still maintaining a signature profile within all that, or is diversity your profile?
For Teeling?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that what we're doing at Teeling is trying to be bold. right, with those flavors. So trying to take whatever either fully matured whiskey or a finish, right, and trying to be quite strong in the direction that it's going. That's what I'm focusing on, at least with that regard. So that could be a different wood type, chestnut or acacia or chinkapin or something like that, or it could be a wine finish or maybe a beer cask. There's a lot of different variety in there, and again, I think that's like when Cashman and I were back in the Cooley days there, right? We had a stock of bourbon and sherry cask primarily, as I remember, John. And I think what I was trying to do coming in as innovation manager was to take those that palette and those flavors and expand it. And I think finishing casks are a great way in which you can try and layer on new flavors and bring new aromas and tastes to a whiskey that wouldn't necessarily be there in the past, right? And so you can do things like stout casks, you can do things like Madeira, you can do things, whatever you want, really, back in those days. And some of them work and some of them don't. But I think the consumers are looking for new and unique and unusual expressions, and that, to be fair, it's not because of Jack Teeling or Stephen or myself being crazy guys and wanting to do crazy stuff. It's the consumers that are asking for it. It's consumers that are saying, what's next, what's new? And you put the new bottle in their hand and they're like, that's great, what's next? No, what you've got in your hand is next. Like, they're always
do you find maybe Seamus and Paul, do you find that it's consumer driven, this request for different casks, or is it coming from the industry and then people are interested? I mean, Alex made his point that he thinks it's consumer driven. Is that what you're finding?
Well, I definitely think people are expecting a finish on a whiskey, but also from my own personal experience, I just like working with cask finishes like beer.
Yeah.
Might become as a shock to some people, but I like to enjoy a beer from now again. And how I first got into the industry was my love for craft beer. So I really love working with beer cask finishes. So that wasn't consumer driven. It's just because I really want to enjoy the process of marrying beer and whiskey together.
Yeah. As far as I'm aware, it's Clonakilty have done a number of cask finishes with American breweries. And I think, Alex, you've done a finish with out in Galway Bay. You've done a finish with them there. I think there might be one other as well. But what does beer bring to the picture? And why did you decide to go to American breweries, Paul?
Well, I do have 3 projects in line with Irish breweries as well. But with American breweries, I guess, as we were wanted to break into the States, we picked up with breweries that had a good recognition in their area already. And if we can work with them, it'll bring visibility to our brand in that new market.
Yeah. And what the differences between working with a beer and working with a fortified wine? Can you explain what the challenges are and what the significant differences would be?
Yes. Well, whereas a lot of fortified wines, I guess you're kind of getting the same flavors, or you're expecting to mature it for maybe 3 to 6 months. With beer, it can be incredibly variable. Say, if you want to work with a stout, I would expect to be at least 6 months maturation and probably released at a higher ABV to get those real chocolatey, roasty flavors in it. I find if you kind of start lowering the ABV, you don't get those chocolatey flavors. But then kind of the opposite with an IPA, and especially with an American style IPA that has a truckload of hops in it, that those can really overpower a whiskey fast. So, I mean, less than a month in a cask will do with an IPA. And you will get a totally different flavor profile. So, say with an American IPA, you'll get huge tropical fruit flavors, which really goes back to what Alex said earlier, to try and accentuate the flavors that were in the base whiskey. So if you have a fresh cut grass hay whiskey and you use it in an IPA, you'll get that freshness with the big tropical hits from the hops. Or if you have a whiskey that's a real solid malt that has a leather, malty, woody flavor, and you put into a stout cask, that malt leather will mingle really well with the chocolate and coffee from the stout. So there's a lot to working with beer, and it really keeps you on your toes, which is what I like about it. You constantly have to taste the whiskey, which is also kind of a bonus.
One of the pleasures. And so are you then, and in general for all of you, are you matching a particular run of spirit to a particular barrel? Or is it more, is it more ad hoc? Is it purely experimental? Or, you're going to go, okay, this is a lighter spirit. I think this is going to go really well with our, I don't know, apple brandy or whatever,
Maybe if I could answer.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, Seamus. I was just going to say, interestingly, John, what we do is we treat the cognac casks they're treated already to match our liquid spirit. So if we know we're going to be placing, we do it in reverse. Yeah. So it's like we know we're going to be putting grain or malt into that. Then the cognac casks are treated already before they receive that Irish spirit, so to speak. And it has a profound kind of quickening and effect to the liquid. The wood then reacts as well in a very kind of, starts off with a cleaner palate, and then it just really starts to develop those esters and turn them into more kind of compounds and flavors. So it's different ways. Seamus, you were going to say as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that I'd argue that no such thing. I mean, from our perspective, anyways, in terms of the ad hoc side of things, it's we have a kind of a run formula in terms of how we're filling and when we're filling, and it'll be obviously American cask being the priority because it's not just bourbon casks; it's casks from Tennessee as well. So, in our case, and then we're onto our sherry, which is our second biggest fill. And then obviously we then will experiment. I mean, we're starting to see the fruits of our labors this in the last previous years and going forward. But we would have done these cask releases previous to this, but we would have had the Millennium Edition, the 100% sherry cask. We also had I think probably one of the first types of finish where we did one in the early noughties. It was a bourbon, sherry, and rum cask. So we were answering to a call that was there with consumers from an international whiskey point of view, not just from an Irish expectation, but there was an international expectation for people to use other casks. So we would have a set run of what we would fill all the time, but we'd also be experimenting, and you're starting to see some of the experimenting, like the Distillery exclusive Acacia would release 2 years ago. You see with the Malaga cask, the Muscatel cask, Banyuls casks, they've been there for a number of years. The Banyuls was there. It came into the Distillery about 3 years ago. So this is kind of, it's not just then we started experimenting. We started experimenting way before this. People talk about rum cask and Bushmills like it's some long lost, lamented love affair. That Bushmills and rum cask should have been together all the time. When you talk about the old Select Reserve, so we've worked with, and at that time would have been seen as the weird and the wonderful because we strayed outside of the bourbon and the sherry safety zone. So yeah, we haven't gone down the beer route, but we have gone down we're very much down the other spirits. We have cognac cask whiskies released last year, and we had fortified wines, dessert wines, so on. So yeah, it's an ongoing mixture of both. Is kind of how you keep that. But that's how you find out what works and what doesn't work. Because I mean, at the end of the day, we work with the same base spirit all the time. So in our case, it's B3D, Bushmills triple distilled malt. And obviously with our grain, that's all destined for American cask. But the B3D is the blank canvas, and the cask is the color.
You said there the weird and the wonderful, and that really brings me back, I suppose, to when myself and Alex first met, and when Alex was High King at Kilbeggan, so to speak, and starting things off down there. There was certainly weird and wonderful distillates coming out. Now, I think the cask policy was pretty what we would consider normal to this day, but I mean,
I regret that actually.
Yeah. But when you were coming up with something that, like, okay, was released 2 years ago, like the Kilbeggan small batch rye, something at the time that hadn't been done for almost 100 years in Ireland, were you thinking about, okay, this spirit, I want this flavor, the spirit to come out, rather than trying to put it into some type of a finish, or what was your thought process?
It was trying to push everything and everyone to the point where they weren't going to break, right? Where it just wasn't going to snap. I was trying not to get David Hines and Noel Sweeney to just like put me back in my box, basically, Cashman. I thought I could get away with slyly ordering 50 tons of crystal malt, and I'd have 2 months before the invoice came in, so then I could start production on that. Before people were like, "What in the hell are you doing?" No, you can't do that, right?
It's too late. It's done.
Well, we've actually already ordered rye from them too. So, and looking back on it, like John, the Cooper down there, right? Yeah. Like really, in hindsight, John Neely and I should have been doing every crazy ass wildfly thing under the sun. If we really had been thinking about it, that's what we really should have been doing. He had a Cooper that was there who really had no bounds or direction as to like what he was supposed to be doing, right? And why didn't we just like start making Frankenstein casks like there was no tomorrow, right? Like it would have been great. But I think at the time, company where I was pushing things a lot and really couldn't push things more without John Teeling going completely crazy with joy and everyone else pulling their hair out, right? That's the feeling that I got.
And then passing over me to try to sell it. Thanks, Alex.
Exactly. And there were crazy things we were doing. Like I remember the green tea casks.
Yeah, Jesus,
right? Like
sorry. Forgotten about that one. Yeah.
Yeah, there were funky and weird things.
We put green tea into a barrel and left it.
Yeah, I went to the health food store and I bought 5 boxes of green tea, and we just stuck it into the cask and filled it with boiling water and left it for a month, and then got John to dump it out and filled it with grain whiskey, and it was great, right?
Yeah, it was. I remember. Yeah.
I never went any farther than that. But
and I remember some stout casks you got from somebody, and
from the porterhouse.
Their
celebration stout. Yeah. Whatever happened?
Those casks they were forgotten about, and I found them about 6 years later, and it was unbelievable. And and that was those days. That was the time then. But enough reminiscing. I'm sure Fionn bring us back on track.
Fionn has just mentioned the bog oak cask, so I think this brings me on to a point that I think is important, and I think it's we've had a couple of releases of bog oak, obviously the Connemara, and not so long ago we had the West Cork distillery, but we have a bit of discrepancy here in how do we describe some of these casks. So we see it happening with peated, and we see it happening with some finishes. So there is peated malt used to create whiskey, and there is peat that has influenced other casks, and then we put liquid in and we call it a peated whiskey. I mean, is that something that needs to be addressed as a separate category? You saw it with the bog oak as well, where essentially they burnt the bog oak and charred a cask and put the whiskey in West Cork, and they called it a bog oak cask. Do we need to distinguish between these?
Well, peated whiskey would be outside my talents, as I've never worked with one.
For the moment, we are expecting a peated one next month.
We always say currently in the whiskey business. So currently, I have not worked with a peated whiskey. So I will pass it over to my learned colleagues.
Is that
Okay,
your
well,
Bill
Seamus,
Clinton moment there, Seamus?
we won't say anything about your work. Have you worked with anything? But we'll move on to, I suppose.
I've worked in a bog.
Yes, that'll
Close
get you
enough.
there.
Yeah, that'll get you there.
No, there are two of you now that have worked in, I suppose, in an environment that has a sea influence predominantly, and obviously that's Lambay and Paul, obviously in your Atlantic warehouse. What are you starting to see are the effects of the maritime environment?
I guess our own warehouse is only about, say, 50 meters from the cliff, and between the cliff and, well, there's nothing between you and Canada, and on a windy day up there, you can barely get the gate open, never mind standing up. So, well, that sea air is constantly howling through the warehouse. So, seeing, I'd say our Angels share maybe a little higher than distilleries who have an inland warehouse, and also because it's a well water there, which is taken from a well which is even closer to the cliff edge than the warehouse. That water we're using to cut the whiskey has a really high mineral content, and it even has kind of almost a salty flavor to it. So we're a little over 2 years into our maturation of our own spirit now. So I think when we do go to release a whiskey, it should have a real kind of salty maritime influence to it.
Yeah, certainly the new make I try to, even at its early stage, did have an influence. But you also have the influence, I suppose, of the sea on your farmland, which is exactly on the Atlantic coast as well.
Yeah, well, where we grow our barley, that's even closer again. That's literally on the seashore. So if you're standing there trying to do a photo shoot and the wind's rushing through your hair, if you have any, yeah, you're getting constantly sprayed with the sea rain, and if you just wipe your forehead, at the end of it, you're covered in salt. So I'm sure that permeates into the grain that we're growing.
Interesting.
And Sabine, you have
Absolutely.
your maturation warehouse on the island.
Yeah, we're literally 10 feet from the shoreline, where our warehouse is. And, you know, the whole environment has its own specific components. There's polysaccharides and fatty acids working with the hygrometry in the environment around the casks. They're all influencing what's going on in that kind of external environment. And these kind of sea spray particles are rich. They're rich with algae, they're rich with iodine, negative ions that have a chemical reaction to, as Paul was saying, the external environment around the casks. So this is what really fascinates me when we watch even the positioning of where the casks lay, if they're on the more western facing wall, if they're on the eastern side of the warehouse. They have completely different taste profiles in terms of salinity and the effect of this kind of sea spray that evolves over time. It's something that never ceases to amaze me. And luckily, where we are, and Ireland in general has some of the highest portions of sea salt, natural sea salt in the air, which is very much a large component of what we're looking for on Lambay. Some of the casks we haven't touched since 2018. We're just really experimenting with the levels of salinity we can push within the cask, in some of the malts, just to really see what are the definitions between those kind of concentrations. And even the wood outside the cask, while it's kind of creating its own kind of fungal environment in the warehouse, it's got you're starting to see some kind of salt, like little kind of crusty salt formation of the wood. All right. Obviously reflecting well the oxidization that's going on. So it's just kind of, it's fascinating. There's a whole thing going on in the environment that we're breathing in when we're working there.
Yeah, I've seen that as well in the past with one of the Scotch whiskey brands I worked with from Isla, who had a very famous warehouse, and part of it is actually below sea level. So the waves literally crash up against the walls of the warehouse, and you'd often see those little crystals inside and on the casks. And then I was fortunate enough to sample some of those in that really low-lying area, and the salinity coming out of it. I mean, you could really taste the sea salt. It was fascinating. And I think that's something that I certainly look forward to trying with your whiskey in the future.
Absolutely. Like the difference, I suppose, with the Islay Islands. Sorry, Dave. With the Islay Islands and kind of the closeness of where Lambay is, where that the Gulf Stream is passing by. We're on a low-lying kind of landmass compared to Paul and the guys in Clonakilty. They're getting all of the cliff face, very energetic sea spray aerosols, whereas ours are a little bit more kind of calm and I suppose even in terms of the spread on the casks. So we rotate them kind of probably every 2 or 3 weeks, because our casks lie flat in a kind of a traditional cognac style rather than racked. So we just, there's the question. So yeah, we rotate them to try and give them a kind of an even covering. So yeah, there's, particularly now after the rather mild winter, we didn't get too much frost or anything like that. The oxidization in the cask room has just been perfect conditions.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Can I ask a question about, and I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of the orientation of your casks when they're in maturation. So I think Seamus, Alex, you're vertically stacked. Paul, I can't remember. Is it vertical as well?
We're both.
Oh, you're both, are you? Sorry, Seamus. Paul?
Yeah, the majority of our casks are palletized, so they are all on their heads. But any casks we get in, special casks from the US or anything, I won't drill the heads, and I'll keep them on their sides.
Okay. And Sabine, yours are all horizontal, aren't they? I think.
Well, they're horizontal for 2 reasons. One, it's, as I said before, we're kind of bringing in the cognac style of finishing, but also because our warehouse is quite small. We only have, probably a max 100 casks, 100, 200 casks on the island. So we're very small scale compared to some of the guys on the call this evening. So we're probably going to have to expand. We're maybe 3 or 4 racks up, but they're all lying flat.
Yeah. And do they make a difference?
Sorry. Yeah. Just wondering, is the floor, what's the floor of the warehouse? Is it concrete, or is it sort of earthen, or is it stony? Is it,
No, they were once. Yeah, so they're on these kind of, well, first of all, they were once the RNLI lifeboat houses. So they were originally domestic buildings. Wow. So you're going to have, already the kind of the leveling in the floor that's done. So it's not quite, earthy. But we placed them on kind of these wooden plinths that are arced. So they're up off the ground to allow the oxygen to rotate around the casks. And then each level is kind of produced in that way as well. So it's quite uniform, but at the same time spacious between each one to allow it to breathe.
Sorry, Sabine, one other question. When I was doing a little bit of research for this, the one thing that absolutely fascinated me that you said in an interview, I think it might have been with Serghios, was that it's usually only between 1 and 4 weeks finishing in the cognac barrels. Is that true?
It depends. Again, it depends on the spirit you're placing into the cask. So, for example, John, like our malts, a malt can take a much stronger cognac cask finish. It can be more intense. And the type of finish we're looking for, we could get that between 3 and 6 months, no problem. Okay. With the blends, when you've got a higher portion grain in the liquid, the cognac cask can be quite domineering. And if you allow it to finish for too long, it will overtake that lovely kind of sweetness and elegance that we want to keep in the grain, which will make up our blend. So, and again, in the summer, if it's a really warm, like 2019 or 2018 was a fantastic summer, 2019, yeah. And what we would have thought would have been 3-4 months finishing, we were doing it in a month up to 6 weeks. It was extraordinary, purely because the temperature had risen so much and the whole oxidization just really, up the ante a little bit. So yeah, it's quite fascinating. But the average time for our finishes could be anything from 3 to 6 months, and some of our cask strength liquids have been in those casks for up to 3 or 4 years, and that's something entirely different.
And for your blend, do you pre-blend before finishing, or you blend after?
Yes.
So it's pre-blended and finished.
No, actually we don't. What we do is we take our grain and we take our malt, we finish, and then we do a final blend and a final finish. Yeah.
Okay. So double finish. There you go. A new one.
There you go. So,
as far as I know,
Yeah,
as far as I know, I think Alex and Seamus, your brands are, I could be wrong, are the only ones that have used more than one particular fortified wine or spirit in a product. I think, Alex, you had brandy and cognac for one of the Brabazon, or was it the Renaissance?
The Renaissance, yeah.
The Renaissance. And Seamus, obviously you've used sherry and port in the 16. What extra complexity and difficulty does that bring, and what does it? What's the enhancement that comes out of that?
Ooh, good question. So what we use in our standard single malt, we'd have 5 different casks that go in there. And I think what we're talking about really with the experience of Lambay and on the island is that it's not a spectator sport, right? Like in order to understand what's happening there with your casks, you really need to dive in and see, like, okay, what's going on? How is it changing? Do I like the changes? Do I not like the changes? And how am I going to try and accentuate that? Or do we have to do something else? And the example like you gave there with the cognac and the brandy, we were waiting for the sweetness that you associate with cognac to come into the whiskey. And 3 years down the road, never got that, and was like, oh, what's going on? And I was on a trip to cognac and realizing that, they add sugar to it. I was like, now I know where the sweetness comes from and why we're never going to get it even after 3 years and these lovely cognac casks that we have, right? And I started looking around the warehouse and realized that there's this brandy, which it's brandy, but it's only because it's been distilled past the date in April, right? And that it really is cognac that's outside the date. And thought, well, that's sweet. And that had the sweetness to it. So we'll combine some of the brandy with the cognac and make a nice little story around there. The other story with like the 5 different cask types for the single malt is that like it's a huge pain in the ass, and like you have to actually get involved in it every time and go up into the warehouse and be picky of like, oh, from the Madeira, I'm looking for leathered fruits and spice. Do I get that? No. Okay, well, where else am I going to find that? Okay, I'm going to have to go to another year. I'm going to have to go to another. How am I going to try and achieve the same flavor profile time after time? And like I said, the only way to do it is to get involved, to get stuck in and try and make sure that it's doing for you what you want it to do. And,
well, my heart really bleeds for you, Alex, having to taste so many times.
It's a hard, noble cause. It's God's work we're doing up there, right?
Yeah, sacrificial lamb they are.
Amen.
Yeah.
I suppose for us with the port cask finish, that's an ongoing addition. So we've kind of we've a baseline all the time for what we want to achieve. So when Helen's working with the 16, she knows what she has, decades of reference to frame back to. So, and how it develops and where it goes, I suppose where it gets a little, and that's tried and tested. And, those dark chocolates, that kind of that bitter coffee character that comes through, that richness, that's very much almost, it's a very different characteristic than the rest of the Bushmills malt families, because, they're fruity and floral and fragrant. But the 16 has it in a very different way. There's an intensity to it. There's sometimes an oiliness or a creaminess to the mouthfeel that you don't get with the 10 and the 21. But where we really see the difference and where we've seen it really working is in the Causeway. When we had the Malaga cask, it went from the American sherry combination after 11 and then 14 years in Malaga. That's where we really saw a ramping up of characteristics where, it was spiced plums and, rich cherry and real. It was an incredibly intense whiskey. And and obviously at Cask it was around 53-54%. You know, it was revealing tons of flavor and aroma characteristics that, you know, you would never have expected, because it doesn't, those whiskies don't get a chance to stay that long in those types of casks, because there's that urgency to get, you know, there is the commercial demand of getting whiskey to market. So you don't have the luxury of being able to leave it for that long in those casks. So I think that was one of the wonderful discoveries I think people made about longevity in fortified wine, and the reasons why. I think we're starting to see, you know, people starting to fully appreciate what whiskey was like 60, 70, 80 years ago in Ireland, when it had those long periods in fortified wine casks, and the influence, because they bring out so much more. I mean, in terms of sugar content, in terms of, you know, the richness and the fruit diversity that you get from currants to the, you know, the usual raisins, plums, cherries, things that you'd never have discovered before. I think that's been the wonderful thing for us, from Bushmills anyways perspective, that we've seen a diversity in our flavor profile brought on by the various different casks, and that fortified, and we've had experience with the spirit too. You know, we had previous with rum, and we've dabbled in the world of cognac as well, in some of our latest editions. And, you know, the latest one we had, the rum finished Bushmills original, where the malt component is finished in rum, and then blended. So we've kind of rediscovered that sense of adventure as well there. So yeah, those fortified casks are amazing. You know, whether they come from Sicily or Spain or wherever they're coming from, they bring in so much character. Depth is the word, really.
Depth, indeed. I mean, if we go back to the 1800s and you think about the whiskey bonders and the pubs, you know, and they had experimented already with this type of finishing, and I have references to a lot of the bonders that were around Limerick and Munster and Cork at the time, and you know, where they were using fortified wine casks. They were already experimenting in their bars after they get their liquid in, and I think you're kind of seeing it in a modern day version now, particularly in the US. Alex, you might know this, as this kind of bars are doing a lot of cocktail and casks in their bar, and you're getting this kind of, you know, small little 5-liter casks on the bars where they're really experimenting, and some of them are doing it good, some of them are not doing it good, but you know, it's part of that experimentation of pushing that boundary to really see, you know, where's the cutoff point. And I think that's something we should never stop doing.
Didn't you try?
I'm reminded as well.
Oh, the old project. I know, Cash.
The little cask.
I heard it. I was like, they had the barrel-aged cocktails. I remember it well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. You know, like, I think it's about trying to bring life and oxygen and air into the category. And how are you going to do that? You can look to the past for inspiration, right? But then you also have to make your own way, and you have to forge your own path forward and do it your way that might have been inspired by the past, but in the past. But it has to be done in a modern way, because you don't have a time machine. You can't go back and do it exactly the same way that it was done before. Yeah. But you know, as long as people are looking for these weird and wonderful and unique and interesting products, then I think that we're in a good spot as far as Irish whiskey moving forward, right? We're not going to go back to we only need 3 megalith distilleries producing the same spirit year after year, right? Like there's
a question in here. There's a question here from.
We didn't have a problem with it for a while.
We have a question in here from Mark. Alex, is a single malt the hardest to get to what you want out of it, especially with the complexity of cask choices?
I don't know if hardest is the right word. It's a labor of love. It really is. It's one of these things that you have to take ownership of. And it requires a conscious effort, and going up to the warehouse and spending 2 or 3 days up there with the guys and having them nearly tear the whole place apart to find the whiskey that's going to be what you want it to be. And as you go through that process time after time over the years, you start to realize that there's several different ways to skin a cat, and that you can get the same results from different areas in different ways. And that, I think, is what's my development as a blender has come into, has been being forced by the whiskey, because the whiskey is maturing every day. right?
Yeah.
If I use, let's say we have 20 casks and I only use 2 of them, right? And I think, oh, I can come back 9 more times and use 2 more, and they're going to be the same those 9 times, right? It's not. It's maturing. It's constantly changing. And so, you have to reevaluate and cut your cost to measure each time that you go up to the warehouse. And the single malt is really a testament to that, because it's a balancing act.
Yeah, I have a question actually for Paul as well. And I don't think anybody else is using Neoc casks. But Paul, could you tell us, our audience as well, what Neoc casks are, and maybe if anybody else is using rejuvenated casks, maybe we can talk about those. But Paul.
Sure. Yeah, so Neoc cask is an ex-Bordeaux red wine cask that is, unlike an STR cask, is hand-shaven and then a strong toast. So I guess the idea with the hand shaving is that it's shaved longitudinally, so that it's along the grain of the wood rather than a grinding wheel which goes around laterally, so it doesn't create a lot of dust. And this dust then can't get stuck into the capillaries of the wood that would stop the cask breathing. So with these casks, I use them in our double oak whiskey. So double oak comes from the use of these European oak casks and also American oak. And for this whiskey, I'll use a variety of different char levels. And these have a huge impact on how I mature the whiskey and the length of time and which casks I'll select. So with these Neoc casks, they're a strong toast. So as different compounds will extract at different rates from the wood over time. So maybe you'll get a lot more spice, say in the first 3 weeks, and then you'll start extracting more sugars, which will start to catch up later in the maturation. I find with these strong toasts, you can leave the whiskey in there longer without, say, the spice overpowering the sweetness, and you'll end up getting a more balanced whiskey than, say, if you went with a crocodile char American oak cask. So then I'll blend, say, for about 5,000 litres, I'll use 5 of these casks in the blend, and they'll offer you a real spicy caramel flavour. And because it's been in there that extra long time, it's a really rounded, complex whiskey you get out of these casks.
Yeah, and you mentioned charring there, and of course everybody's using charred or toasted oak. Can we discuss maybe a little bit about what charring does and the difference, I suppose, between toasting and charring, and how much control we have over that? Is any charring and toasting done really in Ireland? Not, I think West Cork do char their casks, but I don't know if anybody else is.
Well, any end of life red wine casks we get, we'll wheel them out down to one of the fields close to the warehouse, and we'll we'll cut up some of our other end of life casks, and we'll try and retoast or rechar our own casks. Right. We don't. It's a complete bodge, though. We have no way to kind of control the heat or measure them. So it's really just experimental charring we do ourselves. But we put our new make into them, and I think we've been doing a pretty successful job because we're getting some really amazing caramelization from a really hot flame that we're making inside in the crystal.
Yeah. I hope you're not lighting those chars in the warehouse or anywhere near the distillery.
We're surrounded by the Scully family farm, so we can wheel them down to the cliffs there, and we should be far enough away.
Yeah, you can use the straw from the barley stalks, and then you have a complete circle going there.
Let it go. Yeah. I'm particularly interested in like the woods, that you're seeing from Japan. So if it's like ex-shuko casks or the sugi wood casks, they just have a really defined kind of sweetness in them. So something like that I'd like to see a little bit more of. If we were going to be diversifying a little bit, that'd be interesting, because I think we are, unfortunately, in the cask finishing spectrum, there's so much choice out there now, which needs to continue. But my passion would be maybe to go down the road of experimenting with that sugi wood, or, as I say, the shoku woods. They're particularly alluring for me.
Yeah. Of course, Alex, you've got that Wonder of Wood series, a fantastic series that are out there in terms of. So you have the cherry wood, you have the what was the other one? Cherry and
Acacia and Amburana, yeah, the Brazilian
yeah.
hardwood, yeah.
Well, what do those bring that is very different from Irish oak, or sorry, any oak?
Yeah, I think you start talking about non-oak species, right? And there's a whole other, sweet box of flavors that you can start to get into. There's all sorts of other worlds. The Amburana, Jack Teeling likes to refer to it as licking the inside of a piano.
Okay.
I've never done that myself. But I kind of get where he's coming. I was like, wow, what are the parties like at the Teeling household? That's amazing, right? But there's like even chestnut, like and the cask we've got several different chestnut casks. But the ones that I really like are the ones where they've been used for Pedro Jimenez brandy previously. So you have chestnut, which is a more porous wood, and it's absorbed all of this liquid from its, 70 years of being used as a brandy cask, right? And then you bring it into the distillery, and with it still being a porous wood, you can get an impact off of that cask in 2-3 weeks.
It's intense.
And it's pretty amazing. So there's all these sort of things that you can do, and different producers and different people. One of the things that I've really enjoyed in the last couple of years has been collaborating with other distillers, collaborating with other brewers, with other winemakers, and having a chance to have a little bit of their magic or their DNA rub off on you. So like we've done stuff with the plantation rum guys. We've done stuff with different winemakers in France and in Germany. We've done a lot of different experimentation, which has been great. It's been great to have people who you never thought you would do something professionally with call you up and say, we'd really like to do something. What do you think? Most of the time we're like, yeah, let's do it. Let's give it a try.
Yeah, I mean, all that travel is curtailed. Does that mean we're not going to see such a variety of unusual finishes now for a short while?
Containers are still coming into the country.
Barrels can travel.
Barrels can travel.
Yeah, liquid can travel. We can't.
Alex, on what you just said, and I mean, obviously Teeling have been so experimental in all these. Is there a concern that maybe over-reliance on all these experimental barrels and casks takes away from the essence of Irish whiskey and the essence of Teeling? Or is it part and parcel of what you guys are?
I think it depends. It's a fine line there, right? It's a fine line between being weird for being weird's sake, right? And pushing the boundaries and trying to explain how you do what you do. So for us, the collaborations, let's say, was put our grain whiskey and our malt whiskey into a rum cask for a year. And if we can work with other rum producers to explore the impact that process has on the flavor, then I think it's good, right? If you're trying to build into a learning as to how does it actually start to influence our DNA and our flavor and our aroma of our whiskey, then I think it's good. If you're just being weird for the sake of being weird, even a guy from Portland, Oregon, which celebrates being weird,
That's for sure.
I don't really see the point of that.
Yeah, so I mean, Adam is asking that question. Does the group see limitations on the type of cask finishes? Is there a point where it goes too far, as John says, and you lose the essence of what Irish whiskey is? Or are we saying that Irish whiskey, as the title says, we're world leaders in cask finishing? Firstly, do you all agree that is a correct statement?
That we're world leaders?
So.
Leaders is a bit maybe strong, but I think we're strong contenders.
Yeah,
definitely.
Kind of grandiose. I think we like that with Sabine. We like what we do. We hope other people like what we do. I think we're very good at it as an island whiskey nation. We do quite well at what we do. I think people appreciate it, whether you're a long time in the business like we are, or a short time in the business. Whiskey is what is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, if they like what you make, then you're onto a good thing. If they don't, then they're just going to buy somebody else's, and that's just the commercial fact. I mean, I've yet to come across an Irish whiskey that doesn't agree with me. But then again, I'm biased. I found, that we do bring innovation in, and I mean, we need those casks. That's what brings out the best in us as an industry. I mean, we do this very well. We make really, really good whiskey, and I think that's just the be all and end all of what we're about. I mean, we're good at it because it's normal to us to make good whiskey, great whiskey. And the use of the cask is fundamental. And I mean, if we were to be seen standing still and not using other casks, then you're not showing that sense of adventure and experiment, because you learn from as a producer, but also the consumer gets the side effect of that, which is an incredibly well-made whiskey. If we stop using different casks, then it stands still. We'll still produce excellent spirit, and we'll still make excellent whiskey as an industry. But unless we're showing a little bit of adventure and a little bit of trying to bring in extra nuance and subtleties to our distillates, then we'll have lost the reason why we do it. We have to produce the stuff that, for our case, will produce lots of Bushmills and lots of Black Bush. But unless we're doing other casks to bring in certain elements to challenge our consumers and challenge new consumers into our range, then it's this. You might as well throw your hat at it, because it's what it's all about.
Yeah, Gavin there is just mentioning the seaweed cask finishes that we've seen. I think we saw one from an IPA seaweed finish from Walsh, and we saw on Curragh as well. So that might be something that's, but they're fantastic finishes and very interesting. But Seamus, I mean, your Causeway collection that's come out now has been hugely successful. The collectors are going mad for it. Obviously, there's very limited stock of that, and I imagine for the various different types of exotic finishes, shortages and supply of cask is a big concern. But what have you got coming out in the next batch of Causeway collection, Seamus? I know you wanted to announce today.
Yeah. They clipped my Achilles on that one. I'm now gagged.
Really? Okay.
Apparently, I say too much.
Never.
When we first did our first cast sample, Helen had been pre-warned by my previous friend and colleague Billy Waiton in IDL. Be careful, this was going to send you an email a mile long of stuff. And I didn't let Helen down. She got an email a mile long. Hi, I'm in Bushmills now. I'd like to see some casks, please. And there's a lot of stuff coming out. I mean, we have some of Ireland's oldest whiskey laid down in stock, and it's not a brag or anything. It's the fact that they're there and then they're going to be used. We've got a huge variety of casks up there, only dying to come out, and we will have a Causeway 2.0 coming out, and this is our vehicle to show what we can do in terms of that experimental side. And unfortunately, even though I've been on a lot of tasting panels, I can't really say at this point, but thank you for asking. I really appreciate the question.
Worth a go. Alex, I'll throw that to you, and I'll throw it to Paul as well.
Where does it go? I think the world is our oyster, really, right?
Yeah.
And I guess as the American in the room, I'll take the bait and say that, I think whiskey is leading the way when it comes to cask finishes. And, I don't know anyone else that's doing seaweed, right? I don't know anyone else that's doing the, charring and the removal of the layer of the inside of the cask the same way that Paul was describing there, right? I think that Irish whiskey also, by its nature, lends itself to this. The very thing that I think most Irish whiskey fanatics hate about Irish whiskey being called smooth, right? That smoothness, right, means that you can take new flavors and you can layer them on top. You can do things with it, right, that you can't do with a bourbon, that you can't do with a Canadian whiskey, right, that you just can't do with Scotch because of whatever reasons that they see with the way that the world is made and whiskey is made, right? Irish whiskey has a great degree of freedom, both with, I think, inherently in the diaspora of Irish around the world, right? and also with the nature of Irish whiskey being light, approachable, sweet, takes on other flavors and aromas magnificently. And I think we'd be fools not to take advantage of that. I think that's a real genie out of the lamp moment for Irish whiskey.
Yeah. Paul, going on to you then, I suppose you have the audience in the US, of course, who are picking up that, American brewery style whiskey that you have, the finishes there. But there is something else you do differently in the sense of your before your cask is going into a warehouse, in that you bring down the alcohol level very gradually. What's the benefit of that, and what do you how does it affect the end flavor?
Yeah, so I use just say when filling new make into casks, I will also say I will fill bourbon casks at 63.5%, but I'll also fill, say if it's a virgin cask or a recharred cask, I'll fill those at a slightly lower ABV. I'll fill those at 58 to try and get the maximum extraction out of the cask. So I always remember one thing that really stuck for me is my lectures at Heriot Watt, and there was a chart up on the board that gives you the kind of the maximum extraction versus the ABV you're putting into the casks and how different components will extract at different rates at different ABVs. So sugar is more soluble in water. So if you want to extract more sugar, you fill your cask at a lower ABV. And so kind of the sweetest spot with a virgin cask was to fill at 58. And that's what I do with any recharred or virgin cask. And then with the bourbon barrels, fill them just 1% higher than you would with than what with they fill bourbon, which is at 62.5. Just to try and again start extracting different compounds at different materials at different ABVs.
Yeah.
With the gentle proofing of the whiskey, yeah. So cask strength whiskey usually about, depending on the age, somewhere 58 to 60% ABV. If you were to say just immediately pump 1,000 liters of water into your blend, adding water to alcohol is an exothermic reaction, so you generate a lot of heat. And adding all this water at once and lowering the ABV so rapidly will cause, say, your fatty acids and oils to fall out of solution.
Yeah, and coagulate, is it?
You can get a saponification, whereas these fatty acids can turn to kind of say like bitter, soapy flavors.
Yeah.
So I find if you lower the ABV gently, you have the best chance of keeping these in solution, which not only stops the formation of these bitter flavors, but also keeps more flavor in the whiskey, because these fatty acids do have flavor in themselves. That's why a lot of people now are bottling at 46%. It also helps to keep these in solution. Whereas if you went down to, say, 40%, you'd see that haze forming in the whiskey, and that's what the chill filtration is to take out.
Yeah.
So by gently proofing, we want to keep as much flavor in as we can and stop the formation of off flavors, what we're really looking for.
And
it takes about 3 weeks, and it holds up tank space. But if it makes a better whiskey, that's what I'm all about.
And Paul, on the future releases, I know you're not going to name any names, but you said you're working with 3 new breweries. Was there something different you were looking from with Irish breweries than you were when it came to the American breweries?
Well, I'm always looking, because I really want to use as much, say, Irish grain as possible. So, say, I'm not planning on doing peated whiskey unless I can get 100% Irish peated malt. So it's the same with these breweries. I wanted it to be 100% Irish malt, so you really have getting the Irish flavor into the whiskey.
Yeah. And Sabine, I just saw lately, Lambay have just brought out another release on the Cask Strength series. Again, without giving too much away, I mean, where does that fit in the cognac maturation timeline?
Yeah, so they would be, we were originally trying to keep those casks for our cask program, which we started in 2019. So it was kind of where a whiskey buyer could buy a cask and we'll bottle it and do the rest of the business. And basically they would receive the finished goods. But of course, with the pandemic and that certainly slowed down sales. We're a small company. We need to drive revenue, keep our heads afloat. So we decided to release one of our collective casks for public release. Also because we were getting requests from whiskey aficionados saying, I like the Lambay, but I'd like to try it with a bit of a higher ABV. And what can you do? So that was really for us that we listened to the consumers. We, released this cask 4613. It's 57.2% ABV. And I'm listening to Paul there, and I think what's interesting is that, there is a little bit of a kind of a misunderstanding with whiskey drinkers, sometimes thinking just the higher the ABV, the better the whiskey. And I think we need to be really careful about the terminology we use there, because it's really, again, subjective to what you like. Some cask strengths can be super, super strong, and other cask strengths can be really smooth. So it really does depend on all of those factors that Paul was talking about. How do you gently allow that cask to mature? So for us, that maturation, John, is that they've been sitting there since 2018. So they've been sitting, they came to us 5 years old, and they were sitting in that cognac cask for nearly, I'd say 2 years, 2.5 years. So we really noticed an immense amount of finish on them. And then we had to extract it again and test it. But it was pretty profound that if you leave it sit there for 2 or 3 years, it just turned out absolutely beautiful. So we didn't touch it, we just bottled it. And that's what people got last week. And yeah, the 350 bottles they sold out within like 24 hours. Wow. So it's showing a sign that people are, as and again, as what Seamus said earlier, consumers are driving the demand for different finishes. And if we all continue with this kind of diversity that we're talking about this evening, we will listen to customers, we will listen to markets and what they're asking for. And as long as the demand is there, we can continue to produce what we all do. So long let it live.
Yeah. Fantastic. I suppose, in terms of the higher ABV, I think Teeling certainly were very much led the way in the 46% when they started bringing out the standard releases at 46%. What was that a conscious decision as a differentiator or purely a marketing toy?
Yeah, it was very much a conscious decision. And it was not marketing, really. It was I guess to be crazy German guy back in Quebec that was wanting a 50% release. And we did a slight small one there. I think Mr. Cashman might still have his bottle.
Quebec and 50, yeah.
The Quebec and 50, yeah. And realizing that people were looking for something that was a clear differentiation, something that set you apart, right? I can't get the word out of my mouth, from the competition, right? And so 46%, boom, you're no longer competing against somebody that's 40%. What's different about your whiskey? Oh, we're at 46%. Oh, tell me about that. What do you do? Why do you do that, right? And the reason why we went with 46% was really quite simple. We went to the office one day with a cast strength bottle of whiskey and diluted it to 50, 48, 46, 44, 42, 40, right? And then started having people taste it and say, like, which one do you like best? And people, I like that one. All right, great, 46%. There we go. And it had been done previously with single malts, right? There were limited releases of single malt that were 46% non-chill filtered. So that was a bit of a hallmark that people were looking for. Yeah,
we had the Tyrconnells back in the day. They were 46, I think.
Yeah, but it hadn't been done for a blend. And that, I think, was the unique thing, was to take a blend and to treat it with the same reverence that you would a single malt, and to say, okay, we're going to put a blend in a finishing cask or a marrying cask or another spirit type, right? That wasn't being done for blends necessarily, or at least not being called out for a blend. And then to bottle it at 46% was like, whoa, like 8 years ago, that was revolutionary. Now, loads of people are doing, 43, 47, all sorts of different strengths. And I don't think it's a race to the top by any means. I don't think it's like the person who comes out with, 66% wins, right?
Yeah.
You need to have some sort of a reason for it. We had our plantation pineapple small batch that we released at 48.9 or some crazy number.
I have it here somewhere. Yep.
But that's what it tastes best at. That's where you got that pineapple flavor coming through, right? You didn't get it at 46%. So we thought, well, we're going to have to do something with it. But look, it's a limited release anyway. So screw it. We'll just release it at a higher strength. And
I have one question in here from, and Liam asked it a while ago. I have it down as a note. And accelerated aging. Can you give me your thoughts on that?
Rapid maturation. Yes. There's no shortcut. That would be my simple way of putting it to you there, right? You can do lots of different things with small casks, and you can do all sorts of black arts with the charring and the toasting and the previous contents and micro oxidation and ultrasonic UV and all the chips and all the things that you want to try and do there, right? But the reality of it is there isn't any shortcut. I don't think. There's lots of people who try and sell you the snake oil of we can hook it up to an iPad and it'll be brilliant in 4 days. But
What about
isn't an app.
Oh God.
Yeah, there's an app for that. No,
There isn't an app. I'm sure someone will come up with an app. It's the work of the devil.
Definitely agree with Alex on that one.
And may they burn in hell.
I can't believe playing Metallica music at blackened whiskey doesn't age it that bit more quickly than they claim. It's wow.
Well, what about putting staves into the barrel? Other additional staves. So obviously increased wood contact.
Is that allowed?
It's illegal. No.
But there's more to maturation than just extracting from wood.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I've tasted some of these new makes. I know a friend of mine in Scotland sent samples to the US for some of this ultrasonic climate-controlled rapid maturation, and didn't taste like whiskey. I'll tell you that. I tasted more like a super concentrated syrup than it did whiskey.
Yeah.
There's no shortcut.
The
I think
side of it.
Seamus, go on.
Thank you. Sorry, Sabine.
That's okay.
I mean, you lose out on the additive side of it. You lose out on the subtractive side of it. You may get a slight interactive side, but you miss the other two major points to the triangle of maturation. You miss those other 2 points. It's kind of like, I use this phrase a lot. I got it from an old man at home in Brownstone. It's like washing your feet with your socks on. It makes no sense. Why? Why would you, it does nothing other than color or whatever it may do, but you miss the essence of what is whiskey, that interactive conversation almost at a molecular level between the spirit and the cask and what happens over that time period. You can't, I remember hearing stories of cling filming casks to see what would happen, to stop the volatility, stop that extraction through natural wastage.
Sabine?
Yeah, I was just going to second that. For us as well, it's about aromas. And your primary aromas or your original aromas come from your cereals. Your secondary aromas are from the transformation of that cereal into alcohol and apply to it. But the tertiary, aromas appear during maturation and the barrels that they're aging in. And I think, ultimately that's 60% of the color, the flavor, and the taste and the liquid. And that's why I think, it's 3 components, and you can't just kind of mix around. Okay, I'm not against a little bit of experimentation now and again. We need that, but you got to give it a little bit of time and kind of understand those 3 factors. And as what Paul had said earlier, it's not just the cask. It's the quality of the liquid in the cask, and it's the environment outside of the cask. For me, that's as simple as it gets.
Yeah. Well, that brings me on nicely now, actually, to maybe give a little bit of a plug, because we're going to announce that issue 11 is coming out of Irish Whiskey Magazine, and maturation mathematics is probably the first time we've looked at maturation in a cask in a, additive, subtractive, divisive, and multiplicative way. So, we've talked to the industry, and we've done a piece there on the mathematics of maturation. And of course, it's not a scientific process, but there are things that are added and divided. So that's going to be out in next week. So we'll be posting out of that next week. So I just thought I'd give ourselves a shameless plug there while I could. And,
another beautiful cover, I have to say. Yeah, Serghios.
Absolutely.
What magazine is this again? Is this the Irish
I've never
Whiskey?
seen it before.
Yes, that's the very one. So
Irish Whiskey Magazine.
no, if
The
you
one
can
and
remember
only.
that. Yeah. No, but that would be a very interesting take on how maturation is affecting the product. But my other point then, it was, you hear a lot of this talk about 60% of the flavor comes from the cask, or 80% comes from the cask. Let's talk about where we start from. Is there a way of getting, let's call it, crap whiskey to come out well with good casks?
You're talking to the wrong audience. None of us make crap whiskey.
Well, obviously,
Have you heard stories from other places
rumors.
outside of Ireland?
I have heard stories, John. I've heard stories of a distillery on another continent that had a soapy whiskey that they tried for years to try and remove the soapy quality from the whiskey, and you can't do it. I've heard stories of another continent where they had whiskey with a fish sort of nasty flavor to it, and that they were. I've gotten several emails from a man in India who was trying to improve on the quality of his whiskey, and I don't think that there's any way that you can really try and address those issues through maturation, although it would be nice if it could.
There's Frank Murphy making the point about compass box. I remember that there was a whole fuss with the SWA about that. I suppose one final question I have, I suppose, is, you're all relatively, with the exception perhaps of Bushmills, which has a large supply of casks, and Teeling maybe to a less extent. How difficult is it to get good quality casks, and not only good quality, but a stable supply of good quality casks? I think, Sabine, you're sorted because you have the relationship with Camus. But for other distilleries, especially for the newer ones, and they have to go through brokers and get casks through brokers, it's a big expense for them. Maybe they can collaborate. I think there was some talk about the smaller distilleries getting together and being able to buy in bigger volumes so they can secure better quality and more reliable. But how big a problem is it? I mean, Paul, I don't know how easy is it for you to get good quality casks. You mentioned earlier getting some dodgy sherry ones.
Yeah, well, since the boom in Irish whiskey, good casks are rarer, so you just have to really dig deeper to find them. And that's another reason why the maturing predominantly of your new make in bourbon casks has become so popular, because you can guarantee that you're going to get a fresh supply of recently dumped bourbon casks from the US, no problem, whereas getting the sherry ones can be very challenging. And using these casks at the moment, is a great way for kind of new distilleries to put their own stamp on the whiskey they're putting out there at the moment. But I think as new distilleries start releasing their own new make, there'll be kind of a little bit of a less reliance on these kind of more unusual casks to get their own stamp on the whiskey. So I know, for instance, in a project that I'm trying to get going again, it was delayed with COVID. Rather than looking at, say, novel woods to get new flavors into the whiskey, I'm looking more towards yeast, since started my career as a microbiologist. So one way I'm trying to get my new novel flavors into our new make spirit is trying to isolate bespoke and novel yeasts around the Clonakilty and around the family farm.
Yeah.
So there's ways to get around these shortages of casks to get unusual flavors in. You can buy bourbon barrels which are readily available and experiment with your spirit you're putting into them.
Yeah, I definitely think that's going to be the next big thing. I mean, looking at yeast, and I know Alex as well. You is it champagne yeast and wine yeast, not just standard?
We got the
distillers
white wine yeast and the distillers yeast that we use.
Yeah, and Paul,
We're
you're
evaluating
experimenting
that
there
constantly too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean,
I think finishing is one. So not to interrupt you there, but to interrupt you if I may. I think finishing is one of those things that you can use as a tool to create new and unique flavors and aroma in whiskey. But it's only one of them. You can look at the raw materials. You can look at the yeast. You can look at your distillation techniques. You can look at, like Paul was saying there, with your strengths that you're going into the cask and your blending techniques, and whether or not you're going to go with progressive blending or you're just going to go with a straight, more traditional blending style. It's one tool that a distiller has to try and create a unique whiskey. I think the most important thing there is that you own whatever your unique way is. I think what we have here tonight is 4 different brands, that some of them for very historic periods of time, and some of them for very new and short periods of time, have a unique direction that they're going in. I think that's key, right? As long as everyone's got something that they're doing well, then there's plenty of space out there for new entrants and new people to come in. And those challenges that you were talking about there, Paul, at the beginning, like we had that with Teeling also. We had that back in the Cooley days, where the first shipment of casks from a new supplier would be fine, and the second shipment there was like, what? These are totally different than what we got last time, right? And that's the reality of the cask business, because they're each handmade and unique and individual, and every time is a bit of a roll of the dice, but you also get something magical and special out of it at the end of the day also.
Yes, so like on that, I'd say when I'm blending my whiskies, even though I'm doing, say, maybe only 10 casks at a time, I'm not going to be necessarily looking for a consistency of flavor, but I'm looking to make something consistently good.
Yeah,
that's what I'm looking to get out of the cask.
Yeah.
I think this is a conversation that could go on for hours. Unfortunately, we don't have hours, so I
just started.
I was told by the powers that be that an hour and a half. But no, this has absolutely been a fascinating episode. I'd like to thank all 4 of you truly for building this conversation and bringing out some amazing little facts and tidbits that I think everyone can take away with them. And I wish you all individually and collectively every success in your careers and with your liquids, the liquids that are to come out in the future. I'm certainly looking forward to trying as many of them as possible.
I mean, thank you all very much. It's been really, we could keep going for at least another hour and a half, but I get into trouble. Seamus, welcome back. I think you just didn't like your position on the screen. And
I'm in between you guys.
Well, look, it's I'm on the better side now. I work better from the left to right rather than right to left.
Yeah. Well, look, it's been fascinating. I mean, it's so exciting. You don't know what's coming out, and I'm just looking forward to seeing what the fruits of all your hard work and thank you for your time. And I'm sure we'll cross paths soon. We can meet physically. So, Alex, congratulations! I know your distillery is opening on the 22nd for visitors. So
thank you.
We'll be knocking on the door then.
Looking forward to welcoming everyone back. Yes.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward for a pint with you in Mahartigan's when that reopens.
Yeah, this doesn't count as our annual pint, John.
Okay, right.
You're not waiting for John to buy.
We wait a long time.
On first-hand experience, he's not shy. I'll give him that much. He is not shy in buying pints. I've shared pints with him in Paris at Whiskey Live, and no, he's not shy.
Must be just me. Well, look, thank you very much. As I said, it's been an exciting insight, and look forward to talking to you again. So Good evening, everybody. And now we just throw you out unceremoniously, but thank you for your time.
Sláinte.
Bye.
Bye now.
Sláinte.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, I make sure I throw out the right people there. That was brilliant. I really learned an awful lot there. It's amazing to see what's been done. Well, you know, this series is it's amazing to get a first-hand experience of what's going on. So I'm delighted from that point of view.
You know, when we're getting absolute, you know, industry experts together, and you could see tonight as well where someone would say something, you could see everyone was interested in what they had to say, and that's what I love about the Irish whiskey industry.
Yeah.
There's this sense of learning where it's either formally or it's informally, but you're picking up things the whole time, and I think this series is fantastic.
And I want to thank our guests as well, who posed some really interesting questions, and we hope you enjoyed it. Next week we have an interesting lineup, John.
Yeah, you'll have to read it out there. I have,
okay. Well, next week we're talking
sure.
about the premiumization of Irish whiskey and the successful branding of Irish whiskey. So we've got Ruth Dunn from Teeling Distillery. We've got Mr. Ger Garland, obviously from Irish Distillers. John Quinn, I think.
Who's he?
John Quinn. Who's he? John Quinn from Tullamore, and Jarlath Watson from Ecklenville. So that'll be
Brilliant.
A really exciting one to look at, and looking forward to that. So in the meantime, if you have enjoyed the show, please do support it and give us a like and follow us. And as I said, our new release of the Irish Whiskey Magazine is coming out next week. It'll be sent over the weekend, and
buy 2 copies.
Getting your feedback of that. Buy 2 copies, yeah. A backup. Okay, look, thank you all very much. Have a great evening, and thanks for joining us. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.